Okay. Just getting everything set up. Oh, welcome. Welcome, welcome. I see a guest. We'll give it a few more seconds
Welcome.
for people to come in. We're very excited for tonight. Happy Summer Scares to those who are joining us for the Summer Scares program. And even if you are not, welcome on behalf of Syosset Library.
I feel like I should have like the library as a background. Instead, you see my home office and my husband's like setup.
It looks very technical.
Yeah. He's got his 3 monitors. It's just funny because he does like a lot of his work on the laptop that his job provided for him too. Like, oh, you're fancy.
All right. Well, we'll just get started, and if more people file in, more people file in. I will introduce everybody, or myself rather, and the library. So my name is Jessica. I'm Community Engagement Specialist at Syosset Library. As I mentioned before, this is the kickoff of our Summer Scares programming. Summer Scares, brainchild of Becky Spratford, R.A. Farrell, awesome librarian and fan of horror. So we are really excited because I believe, Alma, you're the spokesperson this year, correct?
Yes, I am. I graduated from having a book last year.
I will let my co-host introduce herself really quickly.
I am Stacy Mencher. I'm a librarian at Syosset Public Library. I'm also the technology and applications manager, and woo girl and cheerer of all things horror.
And before we get going, I just have a few housekeeping rules. Number one, you may or may not have heard that this is being live streamed on Facebook Live. So if you're on Facebook Live, hello, nice to see you all. Please tell your friends who missed this program that they could catch it again if they go back to the Syosset Library Trending Facebook page. This will also be available on the YouTube page in about a week. So before we get going, this event is in webinar mode, which means that you can interact with the hosts, that is myself and Stacy, but mostly Alma, because she's who you're here to talk to, through the chat and the Q&A. And we absolutely encourage audience participation and interaction. However, we need to put it out there that this is a fun, friendly event, and any interaction which falls on hate speech, racism, abusive language, inappropriate conversation will have you removed from the meeting, which would be extremely sad, because that's not why we're here. And especially this book that is historical horror, The Fervor, it is just as timeless as ever. So I am actually going to stop talking, and I'm going to give the floor over to Alma.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the book, and if you want to ask questions, that's fine, or then I can go into some of the historical aspects of it. Because one thing I found about writing these historical horror novels, and this is my third, is that people are always really, really interested about the actual history that's in the story, because like all historical fiction, really, it's a mix of real life and things we make up, sometimes just a little embellishment, sometimes pretty wholesale changes to the actual history. But people are always fascinated, and they want to find out which parts of the story were true, and which are the ones that I made up and wove together. So that's generally what I talk about when I talk about The Fervor. But like I said, anybody has any questions, I'm really happy to answer them. If you want to talk about, writing, if you're an author out there or aspiring author and you have questions about writing, or you want to talk about horror, it really is a very growing growing genre these days. It's growing in popularity. We're seeing bookstores adding horror sections, libraries supporting wonderful programs like summer scares. So I'm always happy to talk about horror. But let me tell you a little bit about the book, because it is maybe a little bit of a curiosity in terms of horror stories, right? It's a little different. Historical horror might be its own little subgenre these days. So I'm gonna say a few things, and then I'm gonna ask you a question, and you'll see why I'm doing this in a minute. But here we go. If I said that we had people being locked up in detention camps and children separated from their parents, white nationalist groups spreading fake news about minorities in the other and taking to arms, and anger against the other spreading like a disease seemingly through the air, what year would you think I was talking about? Would you think I was talking about 2021 like most people do? Well, actually, the year is 1944. So I bring that up because I'm often asked, why do I write historical horror? Isn't there enough horror in what we're dealing with today? Why do we have to look to the past? And the lesson that I'm finding over and over in the books is that, you know, that old adage that if you don't learn from history, it's going to repeat itself is so true. And it really jumped out at me when I was doing the research and writing this novel. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the actual story itself, and then we'll talk about the history. So the book starts out in the last months of World War II, and it's told from 4 points of view, 4 different characters. The first is Archie Mitchell, and Archie Mitchell is a real person. He lived during this time, and it opens with him. He's a preacher. He just started with this congregation in Bly, Oregon, and he and his wife, who happens to be pregnant, decide that in order to sort of introduce him to the congregation, they're going to take some of the Sunday school children on a picnic on Gerhardt Mountain. And he drops his wife and the 5 school children off, and he's getting all the picnic things out of the car when there's this terrible explosion, and he runs over there and he finds out that his wife and the 5 children have been killed by some kind of mysterious like bomb detonating. And this is a true story. This explosion, which took place on Gerhardt Mountain, was the only deaths of US citizens attributed to the war on the US mainland. So everything that I described right there is true. What I'm going to tell you next is something that I added. So Archie, you know, after the explosion and his ears are ringing and he's just been blown back to the ground, and he's, you know, trying to help his wife and help the children. But he remembers the last thing he saw before the explosion was a woman in a kimono, a Japanese woman in the kimono standing in the woods and beckoning to him. And he remembers thinking that it can't be, what he's seeing can't be true, because all the Japanese, of course, were taken away to the camps a few years earlier. So that's one character. The second character, really the main character, is Mako Briggs. And Mako is Japanese. And she was sent to America to marry a Japanese businessman in the Seattle area. But she ends up falling in love with that man's, one of his friends, who happens to be white. And when Pearl Harbor happens, like many Americans, her husband, Jamie, signs up to go fight in the war. And he's a crop duster. And the military really needs pilots. So he's desperately needed. So he rushes off to fight, leaving his wife and their daughter behind. Well, she's of Japanese descent. And of course, their child is of Japanese descent. So she's sent off to the internment camps. And she's sent to Minidoka, which is the camp in Idaho. And now we're, as I said, towards the end of the war. And this mysterious disease has broken out in the internment camps. And they call it the Fervor. It starts out like a cold. And doesn't that sound familiar? Starts out like a cold and you feel like you have the flu. But then people start developing this terrible aggression and hostility, part of the reason why they call it the Fervor. And they start attacking one another. And it's an extremely scary, dangerous situation. And she wants to figure out what's going on. But what makes it worse is she feels like the authorities aren't helping them at all, helping them to get better, helping them to figure out what's going on. If anything, they seem to be making the situation a little worse. The third character is Fran Gerstwald, and Fran is a reporter at a daily newspaper in Lincoln, Nebraska. And she happens to be spending a weekend in a cabin in the woods around the same time when she also sees an explosion in the sky. And she tracks it down and finds the remnants of what looked like a weather balloon on the ground. And she decides to try to follow up on this, but she's quickly shut down because the military doesn't want the media investigating these mysterious explosions. But she decides she's going to follow it, among other reasons, because she, as a female reporter, was kind of relegated to what they used to call the pink collar ghetto, right? Parts of the newspaper that women were allowed to write for, the women's pages and that kind of thing. But she wants to be a hard news reporter. And she knows this is the kind of story that'll help her break out on the women's pages. So she pursues the story, and even though her editor tells her not to, and she gets fired, she knows there's a great story there. But soon the FBI and the Army seem to be on her trail and trying to stop her, or at least they're involved in some way. But she's going to, follow this through. And then the last main character is the daughter, Aiko. She's a really bright young girl. We learned very early on that she has this great aptitude for languages. She can pick up languages really easily. She's a great artist. She's always sketching pictures from the folk tales, the Japanese folk tales that her mom are always telling her, the stories that her father had told her when she was a kid. And as a matter of fact, Mako is struck by how much Aiko reminds her of her father, who was a scientist in Japan. Well, it's not too much of a spoiler for me to say at a certain point, Aiko is told that her mother, who has contracted the fervor, has died. And Aiko panics. Here she is in the camp, and she knows her dad is being sent home from the war to try to get them out of the camps. And she doesn't know if her dad will know where to find her. They're going to send her off to the orphanage for the internees, which is at the Manzanar camp in California. So she decides she's going to make her way back to their home in Seattle, which is where they were living before they were taking off to the camps. So she escapes from the camps, and she is trying to make her way to the Pacific Northwest all by herself. And she thinks she's being led by a Japanese spirit, a spirit fox, a kitsune. Now, all of these characters are looking for something. Archie is kind of looking for redemption. He blames himself for not being there when his wife was killed. He would have rather been killed than his wife taken away from him. Aiko's trying to figure out what is this mysterious disease. Fran is also looking for the disease, but she's trying to find a better life for herself, to fulfill her career. And of course, Aiko is looking for family, but they're all looking for the truth in a way. They're all trying to figure out what is it that's going on, what is the fervor, and who's behind it, and what is somebody trying to get with this. One last thing, tying the whole thing together, is a forgotten incident in Mako's past when her father, the researcher, took her and her mother on a research trip that he took to an island off the northern coast of Japan. And this island, which is very remote, was rumored to be very close, like the doorway to the Japanese underworld. So I'm going to leave it at that. It's sort of a setup and a teaser, and hopefully it makes you curious to find out more about what's going on. Jessica, if you want, I can talk a little bit about the history, or if you had questions, we can go to questions. If you specifically had some things.
Sure, I actually, there's one question in the audience, and then we can, I'm curious myself about the history, and actually this might play into the question that was just asked. How did the writing of the fervor differ from the deep or the hunger?
So what made this really interesting to me is I didn't have to research as much as I did for the other books, and there's a reason why. But that first book, The Hunger, which was based on the Donner Party, and I knew a little bit about the Donner Party, not much. And the Deep was based on the sinking of the Titanic, which I know a lot of people are real, they're nuts for the Titanic. And so they've studied it a lot, and they know a lot about the Titanic. But I probably didn't know more than the average person knew. So to write books like these, you need a lot of facts. So I did tons and tons of research for both those books. But this book is actually it's very personal. So I'm half Japanese. My mom is Japanese. She was a teenager in Japan during the war, and she married my father and came over right after the war. I married someone who's also Japanese American, and his whole family had been interned. And when I met them, this was really my introduction to the internment. I had heard about it, but I didn't really know anyone who had gone through it. All my mom's friends were also from Japan. And it was in listening to his family stories, and also we watched a lot of documentaries and read a lot of books, because the folks who go through the camps really don't like to talk about it. And we can talk about why that is, because that's also a really interesting phenomena. But, and once I learned more, I realized that this is a lot more complex than what we're taught in school. And I'm not blaming the schools at all. You know, schools have a lot, history programs have a lot of ground to cover. And so they're trying to teach you, you know, the main thing they want you to learn, like a sound bite, right? That you can easily grasp and wrap your head around. But it really was very complex. There's a lot of layers going on here that I'm going to get into a little bit. But it was interesting to me to write a book that I already knew so much going into, and then I kind of knew how I wanted to structure the story so that we could reveal all those different pieces.
We have another question in
Go
chat.
ahead, Stacey.
Allison asked, were the camps mainly in the West?
So the sort of the West, the Midwest and the West. And that's because there was an exclusion zone along the West Coast. The executive order that put everyone in the camps was to keep Japanese, people of Japanese heritage out of the exclusion zone. So there were a lot more camps than you probably know. I mean, there were a set number of what we think of as the internment camps, but then there were a lot of sort of ancillary camps. There were smaller secondary camps where they kept the people that they thought were, you know, more dangerous, or, you know, that they thought were spies and that sort of thing. There were transit camps and, you know, like I said, for the orphans camps. So the main camps were Heart Mountain, which were in Wyoming, Minidoka in Idaho, Tule Lake, which was in Northern California, Manzanar, which they often say is the LA, but it was east of Fresno, Topaz in Utah, and that's where my husband's family were, Amachi in Colorado, which also went by the name Granada. There were 2 in Arizona, Poston and Gila River, and 2 in Arkansas. That was as far east as they came, Rohrer and Jerome. But, you know, if you've seen pictures of the camps, they were all similar in that they were out in the middle of nowhere. They were like in prairies. They were far, far away from population centers. And one of the reasons was that they didn't want it to be in the public eye. You know, they, for one thing, they, you know, you see the pictures of the camp, they all look the same. They're these single-story barracks-like buildings. They were not finished. They were pretty much just wood siding, you know, with gaps. You could see the gaps between the boards. You know, no walls or very flimsy walls, doors, that kind of stuff. But they were surrounded by barbed wire fences, and there were armed guard towers and armed guards, but the government did not. They highly discouraged pictures of the guards and the guns and the wire fences. Occasionally you'll see one away, but they didn't encourage that in the media.
So you were saying before about the people not wanting to talk about their time in the camps. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, you know, well, let me talk about the executive order and sort of, because that brings up a lot of the reasons why the folks who went through it, you know, are very conflicted about it. And the other thing I should mention is, you know, this was roughly about 80 years ago. We are losing the people that were in the camps. Most of the folks who were adults in the camp have already passed away. And for instance, my father-in-law, who was a teenager in the camp, he passed away about 1.5 years ago. And so the people who really remember the specifics we're losing them. And so we're losing that generation, we're losing their stories. So, a lot of the museums and the Japanese cultural societies, they're trying to preserve as much of that now as they possibly can, which is another reason why I kind of felt it was important to write this book. So let's talk about the executive order a little bit. And just so people know, because I'm probably going to sound like really analytical about this, for those of you who don't know, I was an intelligence analyst for 30 years. I studied unrest, like civil unrest, so especially in the 90s. So I'm used to looking at these kind of situations and sort of breaking them down and analyzing, causal things. So if most people, what they know about the internment is, Pearl Harbor, that was the catalyst. Pearl Harbor happened, and there was this great fear that the Japanese, particularly on the West Coast, were going to be spying for the nation of Japan, and that it was a threat, and that in order to neutralize the threat, that anyone of Japanese heritage should be put in one of these camps and kept out of sensitive areas. That was the idea. But was that the truth? Like I said, when we try to evaluate what's going on in a foreign country, particularly if it's a denied country, right? You don't take the narrative at face value. You try to see what's going on. So one thing a lot of people don't know is that the government actually conducted studies prior to Pearl Harbor, because they knew that there was growing pressure for the United States to enter the war. And they wanted to know if there was a threat from the Japanese who were on US soil. And the War Department and FDR's own office conducted a study. There were multiple studies. Every study came to the conclusion that there was no threat. So the government knew there wasn't a threat from the Japanese, right? But, there was a lot of public support for that. Now, why was there? There were certainly a couple congressmen who were very much grandstanding and playing to their constituents, the fear of the Japanese. But why was that fear there? Well, what I found, and I always knew there was a little bit of this, but once I looked into it, I was really shocked about the extent of it, is that there really was, for decades, a lot of white nationalists, really overt propaganda against Asians on the West Coast. Really, it was, and I think most of us are pretty aware of this, from the time of when the Chinese worked on the railroads, right? But it was consistent and really blatant, like if this sort of thing was happening under today's standards, people would be shocked and outraged at just how openly, they demonized Asians, first Chinese, and then with the war, Japanese too. So they openly, in flyers, in court cases and all kinds of stuff, in newspaper articles and op-eds, said that Japanese were untrustworthy. They were sneaky. They were less than white people, right? That they were subhuman. And they consistently drilled in the belief that Japanese and also Chinese were more loyal to the country of their heritage than if you were a citizen, than the country to which you were a citizen. With absolutely, of course, no basis in fact, no grounding. But because they had been saying this for years, people believed that, and that theme carried through. And so there was this great popular support that the Japanese were a threat and they had to be interned. So even though the administration knew that this was not the case, they sent 120,000 people. That is not a small amount of people. I mean, I've seen 120,000 people in refugee camps. That's a lot of people. They created this whole movement, right? Procured land, built barracks, shipped them out, not to mention the upheaval to the people who's affected, their lives. About 70,000 of those 120,000 were American citizens. American citizens, just told to leave their houses, give up all their possessions, and go live in a wooden shack in the prairies for no reason, nothing you did, right? So that's kind of the scary part, right? It's instructional to look at what happened to the executive order. So it was issued February 19th, 1942. It was literally just weeks after Pearl Harbor. March 24th of 1942 was when the first orders were issued to start moving the Japanese out of the exclusion zone. They were given 1 week to leave their houses. So, I know a lot of people know this story, but I'll just bring it up too. So what that meant is when you were told to leave, you had 1 week to sell your property and get all your affairs in order, which, as we all know, is completely unrealistic. And, of course, there was a lot of confusion leading up to this. Are they going to be able to enforce the executive order? How is it going to work, right? Nobody had any answers. So a lot of families lost everything. They lost their houses, they lost their businesses. If they managed to sell them, it was usually for pennies on the dollar. But a lot of times people knew they were being taken away, so they just waited until they left and took what they wanted. My husband's family had a florist shop in Berkeley, California. They lost that, they lost their trucks, they lost all their equipment, they lost their home, they lost everything. So, yes, just imagine what that would be like if it were you. So the interesting thing was the executive order was revoked January 2nd, 1945. Now, how did this happen? There were certainly legal issues thrown up. People wanted to take it to court. By and large, what happened when the camps, when the order came through, is that the Japanese cultural societies like the JACL were telling people that we have to be good. We have to do everything the government told us. We have to show them that they're wrong, to show them that we're loyal citizens. So there was less of a fight than you'd think. There were people who were trying to take it to court, but by and large, the Japanese in this country cooperated with what was going on, even though it was terribly unfair. The ACLU was looking for like the perfect case to take before the Supreme Court, and they found it. They found it in a woman named Mitsui Endo. Now, Endo, I love this story because I'm an ex-Fed, and she used to work, she was a state employee for the state of California. She worked for the Motor Vehicles Department. And they said that she was clearly, the reason they picked her for the case is that there was no argument that she was clearly Americanized, right? She had never been to Japan. She did not speak the language. She was raised in this country. She was as American could be. Her brother was serving in the army. By that time, the military had gone ahead and said that Japanese citizens, Americans who were of Japanese descent, could join the military, and they did. But she never, it was clearly demonstrated in her life that she never gave any indication that she was anything but a loyal American. There's a term for it. It was conceitedly loyal to the US. And it was that case, the Supreme Court weighed in and said, yes, the executive order was unconstitutional. They did not have the right to incarcerate US citizens with absolutely no grounds, no basis to even suspect, right, their loyalty. So like I said, the executive order was struck down. January 2nd was rescinded January 2nd, 1945. The last camp didn't close until March of 1946. And that was because they were afraid to go home. There was a lot of violence. There were a lot of threats. If they came back, they would be beaten up, they would be killed. Their homes would be torched. It actually did kick off a little bit of an eastward migration of Japanese. It happened to my husband's family. Half of the family relocated to the East Coast, did not go back to California. So it's a pretty important civics lesson for America. To really think through, right? Not just the soundbite, not just the emotional reaction to something. And a good way, I think, to sort of think about it is, I don't know if you all remember, after 9/11, there was about 3 days when the nation took up the question, should we intern people of Arab descent and ethnicity in this country? And that debate died after 3 days, because I do think people look back to what happened in the internment and realize that that was a grave mistake that this country made, and we shouldn't make it again. And for that, I'm really grateful to what those people went through back in the 40s with the camps. And really prove what it means to be an American. Anyway, let's see. After, like I said, aftermath, they lost a lot of property. You know, in 1983, the government under Reagan did issue an apology to Japanese Americans, and reparations were paid. Everyone who had been in the camps was given $20,000 reparations in 1983, but they calculated the loss of property at $2.7 billion, and that is in 1983 dollars.
Wow.
Questions? I feel like I give a briefing when I do.
No, it's also interesting because I was talking with another author for a podcast interview about like certain stuff that you learn in school, and I happen to be talking to Ann Leary, talking about her book, The Foundling, and the kind of eugenics movement in the US. And they kind of touch upon it in like K through 12. I didn't really learn into it till a college course, but I mean, it's briefly mentioned from what I remember in K through 12 about the internment, but it's not really touched upon. Like the Holocaust usually takes precedence, and like all other World War II things. And I remember taking a facing history class in my high school. So I basically call it like the most depressing class ever. It's all about like genocides and everything. But you know, they do mention this, the internments and everything. But what I found interesting is that like it's kind of sometimes talked about. I know it gets brought up in certain things like it's Asian AAPI History Month, or like other certain things that become relevant to it, especially with timeliness of the hatred with everything that COVID brought up. But that's not even where I was going with this. But when I just listening to you talk about it and everything, is there any like reading material or any like sources that you would recommend for those who are interested to learn more?
That's a great question. So, you know, the funny thing is a couple months before the book was coming out in one of my newsletters, I did list a lot of resources, like, you know, some of that are very specific to the internment, some of the documentaries I watch and stuff like that. I have got to put it up on my website or start tweeting them out or something, because I do think people would find those documentaries super, super interesting. The point you raise, and really what I try to get to with the heart of how I'm posing the historical part on the executive order is, you know, again, not a slam against history classes, but, you know, you're given like, just like I often say, a soundbite, right? The quick bullet that you can wrap your head around something. But again, it's a very complex issue. And, you know, I'm here to tell you 30 years as a political analyst, and I supported, you know, both parties' presidents. I worked for the Bush administration. I ended up being pulled over to do policy work for the Iraq war planning and execution. So I'm telling you, this is exactly the kind of thing, right, that goes into every situation like this. But the newspaper has to give you that soundbite, because it's really hard to wrap your head around the complexity of these issues. And, you know, in order to be a good patriot, they appeal to emotional things, right? Like if you just think back to 9/11, how emotionally charged all that was. Well, I'm here to tell you, behind the scenes, you got to pull the emotion out of it, because you don't want to make decisions on emotion, right? Politicians want to make decisions based on your emotions because it's easier to sway the public. But hopefully they're being very sober when they look at it. And that's kind of what I'm trying to appeal to folks about. You know, you go into this thinking it's an emotional issue, and it is on a certain level, but as citizens, it's our job to look at things a little more clear-headed and to really see the truth of what's driving us and who's trying to make us feel a certain way and why. Sorry, I'm such a downer.
No, it's fine. Stacy, did you want to take one of the questions?
Yeah, because we do have some questions in the Q&A. Anonymous asked, did you write the Fervor during the early days of COVID?
You know, I get that question a lot, and it makes sense, right? Because there's a disease at the heart of it. Believe it or not, I started this book in 2019, so it was pre-COVID. But
Wow.
what was really the catalyst for it was this kind of very divisive aggression that was going through the country that prior to around 2016 or so, we didn't really see. And again, as an analyst that studied civil unrest, I'm here to tell you the patterns that we saw in this country, we have seen in every other country with a civil division, right? Like I worked Bosnia Herzegovina, like the 1990s, we called it the golden age of genocide, not in a nice way, right? Bosnia Herzegovina, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Democratic Republic of Congo. I worked all of them, and we saw the same pattern over and over and over again. And so when you see it in your own country, and we were arrogant enough to think we'd never see it in America because things are supposed to be different here in our society. It worries you, and if you're a writer, you end up wanting to write these sort of cautionary tales that you hope are going to be, educational, but we'll see.
We have another question. And then if we don't have more questions, I want to talk general horror and just a little bit about the book. Can you talk about the Japanese mythology that inspired the Fervor, the woman in the kimono, question mark? I don't know why I said question. I don't know why I said question mark.
That's okay. It's really funny to me. The Japanese folklore and supernatural part that I brought into the book, reminds me a lot of my childhood. I was raised a Roman Catholic, right? And in the West, religion is a certain way. We look at it a certain way. And in Japan, it's the whole, supernatural, spiritual side is very different. It's a huge landscape of many, many, many ghosts and spirits. There's not just like a handful of kind of ghosts. Literally, there is a ghost or demon for every temple, every crossroads, every tree, every hill, every creek in Japan. It's just part of your life. And somebody brought up how it comes up in the, all the Japanese characters in the book, except what happens, the kitsune coming up or the ghost. There's a ghost at one point that starts appearing to people in the in the camp and in the dormitories. And the Japanese people just accept it because you're raised to think that's part of your life. But for the people from the Western orientation, it's really shocking. So the main supernatural element in this book is a Yorogumo, which I'm probably slaughtering the pronunciation because I don't speak Japanese. But it's this really interesting demon. It's a woman who appears to men who are traveling, just men. And she's sort of, distraught, and she's carrying a baby. And she asks the men to help her. Would you hold my baby? And if they agree and they hold the baby, then she transforms into this giant spider and she eats them. And any woman, when you hear of a demon like that, how can you not like it? And want to write it, right? It's sort of a demon, it's a demon that gives you power. Most women, I think, feel powerless at some point in their lives. Hopefully that's changing. I know I grew up, I certainly felt that way. And I, had a mother who was a very traditional, meek, submissive Japanese woman, and so the role model is that women were weaker. So when you hear of a demon like that, it kind of makes you feel good, actually. So, and there's plenty to be avenged in the Fervor.
Yeah, it's so funny. I'm like thinking back I took a Japanese film class back years and years and years ago, and I'm thinking back to some of the the movies that I watched, and like I'm trying to remember if that particular demon was in one of them.
In the movies that you watched?
Yeah, and
that would be awesome.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I remember there was one about a woman in the snow who like, if like the man, she married this man, and if he remembered who she was, then she'd turn into the spirit that she was. But it was just I mean, just sort of put in this whole context of such horrible events, and people like with Archie, there's so much turmoil because of other reasons, which I won't get into because it's part of the book. And obviously, it's very different with Mako and Aiko's situation. The idea of sort of attributing spirits to something that's very real but feels surreal behind the scenes, it worked so well.
Oh, thank you. I did really enjoy bringing those elements in, especially the sort of ghostly elements. So Archie's an interesting character. I mean, he is meant to stand in for, especially as I said, as a genocide analyst, like one of the key questions that we ask all the time, and that is about the complicit bystander, right? How could things like the Holocaust, and we study the Holocaust if you do a genocide. Oh, my electricity's flashing in and out. I don't know if you can tell.
Maybe it's a spirit.
I literally, that went through my head. I was like, oh my God.
Wouldn't that be funny? It's a brand new build, so I hope that it's not haunted. But Archie is a preacher, right? And he's supposed to be ministering to the flock. And a lot of times, and it was certainly the case back then, there is the sort of Christian element to these white nativist or supremacist groups. And so they're trying to suborn him, really, one of these groups, and using the death of his wife as an example of why we have to hold the line against these heathens, right? And Archie knows, as a man of faith, and also because he's had Japanese friends, he knows there's nothing to fear from these people. And yet he finds it so hard to do the right thing, what he knows is the right thing. And because that is a question, as genocide scholars, that we have to grapple with all the time. And unfortunately, more people don't do the right thing than do, for reasons that, it's easier to go along, and it's hard to stand up to violent forces and those kinds of things. But history tells us what you need to do. Yeah, it was heartbreaking in a way to write this book in a lot of respects, because it was using so much of what I had worked with over the years. And then on top of that, my family's story, and, watching how my mother had been treated over the years and that sort of thing. So I know I make the book sound like a complete downer, but I really hope that your patrons will give it a read, because the feedback on it has been exceptional. This is probably the best book I've ever written. The reviews have been tremendous. We got 3-starred industry reviews for this book.
I was gonna say, because I pulled up some notes myself for this conversation, virtual author visit, because it's a high praise. I love some of the blurbs. We love Riley Sager here at Syosset. But I think, even though you say it sounds like a downer, it's interesting. And I mean, your other books also touch upon historical horror, but I feel like a lot of patrons love something that could still be kind of timely today. They like having that connection. They like exploring things they didn't really know. I used to work at the reader services desk at our library, which is just we're really good at recommending books for people. And I always would get, patrons be like, I'm sick of reading about the Holocaust, but I really like the time period of, World War II. What else could I read? And this is, I think, a great push, because I just feel like the book covers a lot of different genres. If you want to learn more about history, you have it. If you want to learn, have some horror and have elements, you've got it. If you want to learn, some stuff of another culture, because just seeing when the blurb of it involves kind of Japanese folklore, I'm like, oh, I really only know what I know from anime, and from when I played Genshin Impact, that one of the worlds is heavily inspired from Japan. And I'm I know Onis and Kitsune, I know that, but I don't know much else. But this is cool. You could get, lovers of that. And I think it's just a cool book to explore. And your books are very well written, just as a side note, just saying. But I really like to be able to push books onto patrons, be it could hit different things of what you want in a book. And I think it's a masterpiece.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Really, I so appreciate it. Really want people to read it. But, sometimes a book that seems like it has a lesson to it, a theme or something, people might shy away from it. Or I know you want to talk about horror, Jessica. I'm kind of curious too. I
Yeah.
think more people read horror than want to admit they read horror. And what is horror anyway, right? So we should get into it.
Well, I mean, that is a good point. Well, first of all, the thing that's interesting, you mentioned like my kids watched a kid anime called Yokai Watch forever, and it's adorable, but yokai are generally not supposed to be adorable from what I understand. But I think there is like that part of us that crave horror, especially during times of turmoil. I know I've read more horror than I've ever read in my life in these last 2.5 years.
Really?
Yeah, really. But one of my questions is, so this is historical horror, as was The Deep and The Hunger. You hear a lot about alternate history, which could have some
Yeah.
horror elements. Um, do, do you think like the two could mix, or they have to be like historical horror has to draw on specifically the history that happens versus on what could have happened?
It's interesting. I did an article on this. I forget who it was for, one of the book sites. And so it really made me sort of think about what the definitions are. People love definitions, but of course we know in real life things are much more messy. And there's really like no fiction police that are going to come after you if you don't obey the rules. So really, if you're thinking about writing, you can do whatever you want. But generally, I mean, I tend to think of alternate history as something where the outcome changes. So like if you look at Man in the High Castle, and I didn't read the book, but I did see part of the TV series, it's not that the war turned out the way it did in real life, but that something, major happened or that sort of thing. So, I mean, it could, I mean, in a way, you might think historical horror would be that, right? Because there's this horror element that we're pretty sure didn't happen in real life. Like if we look at The Hunger, which again was about the Donner Party, and it was pretty bad enough as it is. But then I tried to open this question, right? Like, what if there was something out there on the plains with them that was contributing to all the terrible things that happened? So it just added that little element, but it didn't change any outcomes. I really stayed close to the history. It's a great question. Like, what is historical horror? How is that different than, say, historical fiction? Or, I tend to write fairly close to actual historical events, as opposed to just picking an era and putting my story in it. Like, writing my own Jack the Ripper story-ish, maybe not making it Jack the Ripper, but a similar thing, and putting it in that period. That's what a lot of historical fiction does. It's not necessarily tied to actual history. It's just moved to a different period in time. So it kind of leaves it up to the reader to really figure out what's in that book, and is it going to scratch their itch? So, personally, I find it very interesting because to write this historical horror, to just add these little nuances of horror, because let's face it, there's a fair amount of horror in everyday life. Again, when you're a genocide analyst, you get to see that up close and for real. If you look, if you pay attention, you might find that there's more horror in your everyday life than you thought. And, when you look at history and you start really looking at the details, it's just fascinating. It's usually a lot more scary, than we're led to believe.
And I think that that's one of the reasons why the Twilight Zone worked so well, especially, yeah, because like in my opinion, and this is just an opinion, the best episodes and the scariest episodes of the Twilight Zone were the ones that really just felt like next door, like something that
Oh, that
really
hit a
was
little close to
happening,
home.
maybe slightly off. What did you say, Stacey?
The ones that hit a little too close to home.
Yeah, it was like really akin to what was going on, but maybe it was slightly off kilter, but like you didn't need, I mean, and I'm not going to knock episodes of Twilight Zone, they're classics, blah blah blah, but you don't need the alien with the third eye on the head to be scary. Sometimes it's just how people interact with each other when they think that they are going to be othered, or they are going to be the ones caught in the bomb, or those were the scariest episodes.
Well, that's the challenge of writing good horror, I think, is convincing people, writing it in such a way that people can be convinced that it's real. And my first 3 books were not horror per se, but they were supernatural. And that was the thing that like Publishers Weekly used to always say about my stuff, that I could make the supernatural feel real and plausible. It's really hard to do, especially when you start looking at horror tropes, like werewolves or vampires, which, is fun for most people these days, right? And we know there's no such thing as werewolves or vampires. We may want it to be true, but we know it's not. And so for a lot of people, those kinds of stories are almost like amusement park rides, right? It's a nostalgic thing. They like being in that mindset, but they're not really scared. That's why real horror is so hard to write, because you've got to put people in a place where, where they can see that the edge between something terrible and where they sit is very thin. And I kind of think that's why I write horror fairly well, because I've just had to be so close to what I think are some of the worst things that, that anybody can be made to go through.
I think go ahead, Stacey.
I was gonna say, it's interesting that you say that, because like in past discussions with other horror authors, or just even researching on my own, because you say about like the definitions. I used to do like the subgenres and like pretty much like categorize everything. And I was like, oh, our horror section's getting kind of big for it to just be like horror. So I'm like, what are some subcategories? But it always comes down to the root of that, like horror, unlike other genres, it plays more with your emotions. Mm-hmm. And I do think you have that like nostalgia or like thrill ride with, werewolves, vampires, those tropes. But when it's like sorry, your books or like similar authors, you touch upon that emotion that someone's like, oh, like this could be real, this could happen to me. Like, I mean, like throwing like ghosts in there, like, it could, that's kind of like one of the tropes that could go either way, in my opinion, of like, oh yeah, like I watch Ghost Adventures just to like scare myself, because like that could never happen. And then cute to like 2 months living in my house, and I hear a music box go off in another room that no one is in. It's the middle of the night, and I'm like, oh God, I gotta wake up my husband. Something's in the house. And like, and I remember before a friend of ours was like, oh, my house is haunted. I threw like holy water everywhere. I was like, get to my house, bring the holy water. Like, yeah, I was like, oh my God, what happened in my house?
So
and those type of things. But it really pulls at your emotion more than I think other genres do.
Yeah. And to do it well is hard. Like, I think ghost stories are incredibly hard to write, because it's so easy to sort of fall into cliche. And then it's not scary, right? People are like on this track where they know what to expect. A good ghost story, a convincing ghost story, is really hard.
Though, recently a really good vampire story, or at least I thought it was Midnight Mass. I don't know if you saw it.
Yes, that was very good.
Yeah.
Sorry, I actually just gave a big spoiler about Midnight
Spoilers.
Mass.
We try to do no spoilers. It's been out a decent amount of time.
Okay, fine. It's that vampire is out of the bag for like a while, but that was I was not expecting it to go in that direction. And it started off slow and creepy. And I felt so like ashamed that I didn't see it coming. And
Oh,
they
wow.
made it scary. That was good.
It was good. What I really liked about that is, of course, there was this huge religious component to it, which was fitting because a lot of our concepts about evil and where these things that commit these horrendous acts come from, they're all weighted in religion, and in America, that means Christianity for the most part. So I really appreciated that they explored the relationship between the two in that story. Yeah, I thought it was really well done. You had to get through the kind of monologues in the beginning. They did give some of the actors some long passages.
Yes. It felt very much, I think, like a real personal story of Mike Flanagan's. Not that his other stuff was just great, but that was one that you had to get through that, because I remember people telling me
slow in the beginning. I was like,
oh no, it gets good, and it does, and it's scary.
I was just like, I like this, but it's not something I could binge. Like his other stuff, I could binge. His other stuff, I haven't watched his movies. I just watched his series on Netflix. But something like that, I'm just like, all right, this is going to be a lengthier watch because I don't want to sit through 2 episodes of this and then be like, all right. But no, I like when it's like that. So, listeners, watchers of this, it's a good audio-visual recommendation if you like horror.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of it. Like we said, horror's gotten quite popular over the last few years, not just in books. And I think a lot of it has to do with streaming television, as it just exploded so much visual input. And they do a lot of horror, all of the channels now. So,
yeah,
hopefully it's feeding each other, helping to feed the public's taste for horror, for good horror. There's a lot of great horror being written right now. Books this year, I get to blurb so many of them. So yeah, they're fabulous books.
This is actually, so before we close then, what else in the spirit of summer scares, what do you recommend to read? And also, I guess
not where I thought you were going necessarily.
Watch.
I thought you were gonna be like, what scares you?
Well, I mean, the question is part of that as well.
Well, as far as books go, we've got some great books in the Summer Scares program. So you're going to be pushing that. And so that would be my number one thing. Definitely check out the Summer Scares program. There's some books that are coming out this year, so they won't be part of that program because they generally don't do like brand new releases. Anybody who likes horror already knows the name Paul Tremblay. Well, he's got a new book coming out this year called the Pallbearers Club, which it kind of defies description. It is amazing, like all of his books, complex, but incredibly readable, right? The story just pulls you along. But basically, very basically, at the heart of it is a high school boy. He's getting ready to graduate. He's got a lot of problems in his life, and he's just trying to get through. And he starts going to funerals of like homeless people in sort of an official capacity. He's sort of there as a pallbearer, as a witness. And he runs into this young woman who also shows up to be a pallbearer at these funerals, but she likes to take pictures of the corpses. And that's the beginning. And it goes just amazing places from there. So I just really encourage you to keep an eye out for that. Any Catriona Award books, of course, are worth reading. She did one of the biggest hits last year, which was The House on Needless Street. And then her book that came out a few months ago, Sundial, her latest book, I think is even better than Needless Street. Definitely worth reading. She's a fabulous writer. There's a writer by the name of Gabino Iglesias, who had books with indie press, but he had his first big traditional publishing house sale, and it's coming out this summer, and it's called The Devil Takes You Home. Now, I preface it by saying they're violent books. It's kind of like the violence level of like Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul, if you're used to or Ozark, which is one of my favorite TV shows. So if you like that level of violence, you'll be fine with the book, but it's just an amazing story. And one of the things that I find most amazing about it is, it's really hard to come up with something new under the sun when it comes to horror. Pretty much it's just how you explore something. He actually came up with something totally original, and I still think about it. It is such a good book, and I hope your patrons will seek it out.
Thank you for the recommendation.
Absolutely. Very much looking forward to it. And are you writing something else at the moment?
So with Red Widow, which was my first spy novel that came out last year, now I'm sort of, with the publisher, we're sort of leapfrogging. So one year it's historical horror, the next year it's a spy novel.
Oh, cool.
So because The Fervor was my last book, the next book to come out will be the next book in the spy series called Red London. And London is a little bit of a giveaway. It has to do with the Russian oligarchs in London, who have for the last 15, 20 years have sort of taken over London. And it's become incredibly timely with what's been going on, with Russia's attack on Ukraine and the whole sanction situation. It kind of forced Western countries to the fact that they've kind of let Russian money infiltrate our systems, not for the better. So that will be coming out in the spring of 2023. And I'm just at the point where I'm trying to figure out what the next historical horror novel is going to be about. So yeah, stay tuned for that.
Ooh,
You have so
exciting.
much to work with.
Yeah.
So much, Alma Katsu, for being with us. On behalf of Syosset Public Library, on behalf of Summer
thank
Scares. And we look forward to what comes next.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Eagerly.
Have a wonderful night. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.